Happy New Year. Hello and welcome to another episode of Connecting the Dots, a podcast series produced by the Next Year Group where we discuss energy issues around the globe. I remain your host, Emeka Opobara. We are very excited to bring you the first episode of the year 2024. Today's episode is titled Progress Outlook, the 2024 Energy Year. Our guest today is Mr. Sadiq Wanka, who is the Special Advisor to the President of Nigeria on Power and Infrastructure in the Office of the Vice President. Welcome, Sadiq.
Thank you so much, Mecca.
Excellent. So, Sadiq, could you please just give us a quick background and introduction of yourself and your experience?
Of course. No, thank you. I started off actually as an engineer, so studied chemical engineering and then also industrial systems engineering. But really, most of my professional life has been in management consulting, working at KPMG and McKinsey and Company. And majority of my role or projects that I did as a consultant were really around transformation projects, helping companies and public sector institutions to run turnaround programs, typically for revenue or for cost reduction. In the last couple of years, I have actually been more on the operational side, running as a developer, running a renewables company, just before I took over this role as an advisor to the president.
Excellent. So you're the man for the job. You've turned around a lot of companies now. So you're the person we need to turn around that power sector.
I hope so.
Okay, so there's really correlation between power supply and economic growth. As I say, as power goes, the country goes. If we increase power supply, the country will improve a number of indexes from economic growth, from healthcare, all sorts of things are really tied to the power sector. So in 2023, there was a number of activities in the power sector. How would you rate the performance of the sector in that year on and off grid?
I think 2023 was certainly a mixed bag. If you just reflect on many of the events that occurred, obviously from a sector governance perspective, you had the passage and signing into law of the Electricity Act 2023 by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, which would really reshape, the landscape of the sector, going forward. You also had the Honorable Minister of Power, convening the ministerial retreat in furtherance of that new act to come up with a sector roadmap and implementation plan. There are other things that obviously happened in the sector. On generation, you had the Zungeru power plant that was completed. In transmission, you have the rejigging of the Presidential Power Initiative, which Mr. President and the Honorable Minister of Power championed. And in distribution, we did see quite a few of the reforms, at least, that had been worked on in the last 4 or 5 years, leading up to some very positive gains up until mid-year this year, when we saw a very drastic reduction in the subsidies that were being paid in the sector, right up until the FX reforms that came into be. So definitely a bit of a mixed bag, because now you also have issues around tariff shortfalls that have now begun to accumulate and are projected to reach 1.6 trillion naira by the end of this year if nothing happens to tariffs. You still have lots of stranded generation capacity because they typically isn't evacuation infrastructure, and the distribution companies are also not able to offtake. And obviously collections and governance issues remain very prevalent in the sector. So a bit of a mixed bag. I think there's some reason to be hopeful with the new Electricity Act and the roadmap and implementation plan that the Honorable Minister is championing. But the sector challenges are many.
Excellent. So one of the things I think most Nigerians, most of us in the sector, need to change our mindset on how we refer to the sector. We refer to it as a sector, not as a market, right? A market, has a willing buyer. I laugh because it's a word that we're all very familiar with. Willing buyer, willing seller. And it doesn't seem like that's the case because there's so much collection losses and so many losses in the sector, and revenue assurance is not there. So from government is here to create an enabling environment essentially for the private sector. So what's government doing to create this enabling environment to now turn the sector into a market?
I think a few things, need to happen for you to have a properly functioning market. One, obviously, you need to do something on tariffs such that, to your point, there is a willing buyer, willing seller situation. Or at the very least, we have a situation where, these tariffs are actually, cost reflective. If the government were to withdraw its presence in the market, still have a functioning market, without the government having to pump in trillions in subsidies. The biggest levers also that the government has in its arsenal is around the issue of governance. I think one of the things we might forget so soon is that as of Q2 last year, I think you had something like a 95% market remittance of discos paying their bills back to the market. But 4 or 5 years ago, that number was a fifth of that, because typically discos had the wherewithal just to decide what to do with whatever revenues came in. But through concerted governance initiatives like the payment waterfall that is being implemented through the central bank, you had a situation where market remittance did go up. So we do need to look into governance issues, really to make sure that the right people and the right management are owning and operating discos. Because at the end of the day, these discos are a business, and you need to have the competence to be able to properly segment your customers, visually be able to understand, where your energy is going, where are you losing it, which customers are paying, how much can they pay. These are like business 101 questions, but unfortunately, I think just the way the market has been structured and the way we have governed discos hasn't really allowed the best hands or really the best incentives for discos to necessarily operate in this manner.
That's a really good point around governance. One of the challenges I think we have in the sector is the structural changes on ensuring that the governance structure of the operators is correct. If we look throughout the value chain, we can see that the governance structures of some of the discos is not where it should be, given all the activities that we're seeing and we're reading in the dailies. Government essentially owns 3 or 4 of these discos that are now defunct or that are now in receivership. As they move off government hands, are there plans around improving their governance structures? And also, what could we expect that's different now than would have been 5 or 10 years ago when these things were privatized?
I think there may be a few things to mention here, right? I think one, from a governance perspective, the one thing is that there is now widespread realization that it has to be a priority. I think if you follow the news recently around the MOFI BPE conversations, most of what MOFI is putting out there in terms of what it plans to do going forward on discos really centers around how do we strengthen governance. Obviously, MOFI can only do so much, or whoever is the custodian of government shares can only do so much. You really need the regulator to be able to wield its stick when licensees underperform. And I think we've seen increasing appetite from the regulator, NERC, to really take action on licensees that it considers to be underperforming. I think we've seen very strong action that has been widely celebrated with the Kaduna disco situation. And I think NERC needs to keep that pace and keep identifying underperformers in the market and making sure that they don't drag the entire sector and the entire NESI down. So I think those are things that are certainly, I would say, that are happening on governance. There are issues, of course, around board representation and ensuring that the government is putting in place competent hands to represent its interests on boards, that they're the right number or proportionate representation given the shareholding of government. Obviously, the landscape is becoming even murkier now, as states get involved, perhaps also want representation for their own shareholding in discos, which in fact is more than the shareholding of federal government. So typically on average, I think states have 27% shareholding in these discos versus federal government's 17%. So how we collaborate with state governments to have the right representation on boards and to work collaboratively with the regulator to enforce market rules, I think is really what would make the difference in the coming years.
Excellent. I really want to get to the States Electricity Act conversation, but I wanted to ask you two quick questions on market shortfall. What does that number look like on a monthly basis, and who more or less makes up that gap?
Yeah. So first of all, if you talk of like tariff shortfalls, which obviously more concerning to government, because then government is subsidizing. I think currently you have a projection that is about 1.6 trillion naira, by the end of 2024. That would be accumulated just over 1 year if tariffs do not shift for this year. I think the analysis that was done at least in a few months ago, and I haven't looked at the NERC order in detail for this most recent tariff order that they issued, but it was 5 discos, I think, essentially, that were driving the lion's share of the issues, in terms of shortfalls. And I think, of course, market shortfalls differ from disco to disco. You have discos that are, accumulating, something like 2 billion naira a month in market shortfalls. But these are shortfalls deficits that will be on their books versus on the government's books. So they are an issue because ultimately they would affect the discos' ability to continuously invest in their network and to improve service quality, but maybe not necessarily so in terms of contributing to subsidies that the government is paying.
Interesting. That number is scary to me. 2 billion naira worth of losses. That's essentially $2 million, depending on the exchange rate you use. So more or less what you're saying is you have discos that are open for business that lose that amount of money on a monthly basis.
Of course, yes. Even more than that, you have discos very easily that 60 billion naira in the red when you look at just their cash flows.
Then why open the door?
Shut
it down and move on.
Right. Yes. It's an interesting one, right? I think we're in this situation where there are many levers that discos can look at to close many of these gaps. I think they're very well known. Anything from metering to improved, infrastructure to even ensuring that the people that you're actually billing, you're actually collecting money from them. I think for most people that are observing the Nigerian electricity market, it's kind of insane that 75% of the bills that you do send out to customers, these are customers, their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, but you're still unable to collect, 25% of those bills. Not to even talk about like the customers that you haven't identified that are actually just, stealing electricity. So you have, just from a billing and collections perspective, a 40% gap that can be closed, right?
Interesting. So it sounds like, we are in a situation where we've done something for 10 years. It hasn't quite worked. That's why the EA Act of 2023 is a good approach to now see what else we could do differently, because clearly if there are discos that are not just this, we point at discos as the problem, but there's other parts of the value chain as well. So it's not working across the value chain. So we've moved into this EA Act of 2023. What do you think the future of electricity access looks like with states now being involved? And how do you think states' involvement would really change this sector? Is it for the better or for the worst, or or TBD?
Yeah, I mean, given that we are in a market economy and we like to wear that hat typically, we would say, increased liberalization should be good for the market. So if you have increased number of participants in the market, hopefully that should, in the long term, bring in some efficiencies. So hopefully that augurs well, I think, for the market. But I think we do need to manage properly that transition and the onboarding of states to becoming regulators. I think many people would say that we are having capacity issues at the federal level. So one can only imagine what would happen if you cascade that to, 36 subnational units. So I think we do need to be clear around what is the checklist and conditions that states would have to meet before they can take over regulation of different sections of the value chain. I think states also need to take the opportunity, I think, to be modest, I think, in how they take advantage of the Electricity Act. I think a lot of experts would say that states focusing really on the retail side of the market is where they would get the most bang for their buck, right? Versus trying to do everything, trying to say we want to do end-to-end generation and transmission. Because the Act really restricts you quite a bit. As soon as you cross over state boundaries, you're now within the realm of the national regulator. So the section of the value chain that I believe state governments can most really take part in would really be on the distribution and retail side of the market. And, one can imagine as a state, you facilitating investments, even in transmission that is being regulated by NERC, the national regulator, that then brings stranded electricity capacity from all of these generation plants all across the country to your state borders. And from there, then you regulate the distribution to homes and factories within your states. I think also we would hopefully see a much stronger participation of state governments in the electrification problem, right? So you have like 90 million Nigerians today that lack access to electricity. So you need states to take a much more active role in funding and really in regulating the, whether it's mini grids or other distributed energy sources to rural communities, people that, currently lack access. So I think thankfully there are also a few things that the national regulator is taking charge on currently now, convening stakeholders to really sit down and deliberate on what is the new national framework for electricity markets, in light of the Electricity Act. And I think, those conversations, hopefully as long as they're honest and all-inclusive, I think we would be in a very good place to really understand the implications of the Electricity Act once all stakeholders have truly given their input.
Excellent. And just so we're clear, when you talk about the retail angle, that's essentially the states being involved in the wires business, right?
Correct.
So where more or less the Genco through TCN dumps power at a certain place, the state then is involved with selling that power rather than trying to transmit, generate, buy gas, and all sorts of things in the value chain. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly.
Then there's this conversation that's getting a bit deafening around the importance of the ISO and TSB. Is this the right time for that conversation, given all the different moving pieces in the sector, as far as splitting up the independent system operator and the transmission system provider? Is this the right time to do it, or should we wait until states have their own market and then begin that process?
I think it's absolutely the right time. Thankfully, one of the things that has happened over the last decade is that within TCN itself, there's actually a relatively clean separation between the ISO and the TSB. So the leap to actually moving or formally separating these entities hopefully should not bring much chaos to the market. And I think once you have a TSP that is separate from the ISO, can then have these two separate entities much more accountable to the regulator in terms of what they actually need, to fulfill on their respective mandates. You can imagine, there's a need really to recapitalize the newly formed, ISO ISO to make sure that completing, whether it's a SCADA system, you're investing, spinning reserves, other capacity to be able to integrate renewables into your network. And really on the TSP side, you then are putting the TSP in a much better position for concessioning of different parts of the transmission network to across maybe different regions of the country, so that those new concessionaires can then bring in fresh capital to be able to expand the transmission network and serve not just the national grid, but then to be able to really respond more to the changes that are happening, in light of the Electricity Act. So I do think that the timing definitely is right. And obviously down the line, you can even foresee a picture where there are also like multiple ISOs within the market. As the market progresses and you have like regional pools of power. So definitely the right time, because I think a lot of the preliminaries have already been in place, I think, for some time now.
That's a really good point, because the states now having access to develop their own policy and their own law. There should be, and I think I know NERC is trying to do this, there should be a cohesive approach in the regions, right? Because if the acts and the bills are different for each of the states, there could be standardization issues as far as investors are concerned. So I'm hoping that the states take warning, like you said, and not gallop too fast, and do it from a cohesive point of view where an investor knows I'm coming to the Southwest region and I can invest in transmission, and I know I can effectively play in the 6 states, rather than, the senders are different in each of these states. Besides the efforts from the regulator, do you know any other cohesive efforts that are being done to kind of get states to be on the same path?
Correct. So I'm aware of the Nigeria Governors Forum that has a consortium that is really coming in, partnering with the Nigerian Governors Forum to really provide step-by-step expertise to state governments regarding like building the capacity to actually enter into this new venture of regulating electricity markets. Everything from how do we build human capital capacity, to how do you begin to attract investments, help to build business cases, what sorts of regulations should you have. And I think the fact that it's under the banner of the Nigerian Governors Forum and all the governors are sitting there, hopefully that should begin to also drive some of that cohesiveness and standardization that you refer to. But absolutely, now that you have some states that have already signed into law different electricity acts, in light of current conversations that are happening, hope is that some of them would go back and look into what was passed into law, see how these laws can be better harmonized across all states.
Just remember the point that the United Kingdom Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility, NIAF, UK NIAF, did work with the Governors Forum on this. There was a forum held, I think about 3 months ago, on bringing this together. And with the regulator, they're working on creating a toolkit for each state to kind of go through. These are the steps you must take. If you have this, do this. And more or less setting it up where states know that they're going through it from a methodological approach, not just from, we want a law, let's just draft something real quick and pass it. Yeah. So those sorts of intentional acts is what's going to drive this sector. If it's not intentional, we're going to get to a point where things happen and laws end up not really doing what they're supposed to do. One activity that keeps coming up from COP28 that just finished, there was conversations around mitigation, adaptation, and all sorts of things on climate. It got me thinking down to the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan, which used to sit squarely in the OVP's office in the former administration. Where is that plan currently now, and as far as where is it domiciled, and how are we tracking towards that progress towards net zero by 20?
By net zero by 2050, is it? Yes. So I think there's still a lot of collaboration that is happening with the Office of the Vice President on the Energy Transition Plan. I think it doesn't maybe sit as neatly or report as neatly to the OVP currently as it used to. But I think that's something that is also being worked on. But I think, if you kind of reflect on the Energy Transition Plan and you kind of break down at least into some interim milestones of the 30 gigawatts by 2030, and 30% renewables, at least renewables being 30% of the energy mix by 2030. And you kind of then reflect on where are we in that journey. I think there are a few things obviously that have happened that are positive. You've had the Nigeria electrification plan, which achieved connections, new connections of 1.5 million, equivalent to probably close to 7 million Nigerians being connected, either newly or improvements to their supply. You also have the DES program that the World Bank is driving, through the Rural Electrification Agency that has been approved. Again, that is intended to further connect, 17.5 million Nigerians. So there's some positives, I think, that have happened, but definitely also a lot of gaps. So again, if you think of where we are today in terms of, on a good day, wheeling 5,000 megawatts of capacity and maybe just 1,000 megawatts of that being from renewables. If you want to get to, 30% of 30 gigawatts by 2030, that's 9 gigawatts of renewables that you need to get to. Right, you're currently maybe at 1,000 from hydro. So how do you bring online new hydro projects? I think there's some work to be done to fully bring Zungeru onto the grid. You have the long-delayed Mambila that is, I think the current design is 1,500 megawatts. But really, you also then have to be a lot more aggressive when it comes to, other renewables, especially solar. I think if we're going to make any progress, you need to be seeing, 1,000, megawatt solar farms coming up. And how do we think about, all the enabling environment for that to happen, especially on the on-grid side? There isn't yet, any project that has come online. There are many ideas, the 14 solar IPPs, different developers that have, proposed. There's a 1,000 megawatt solar farm in Jigawa. There's 100 megawatts for each of the 19 states. There's the Sun Africa proposal that I think it's 1,000 megawatts to start with. But all of these projects are struggling in terms of evacuation infrastructure, getting offtake agreements. So I think we really need to sit down and think around, what is that framework that would facilitate on-grid solar power projects. And you really only need one to work, for us to be able to understand how do we scale. But more broadly, I think on the energy transition, even natural gas was supposed to be, is supposed to be our transition fuel, and the dominant source of fuel, going into 2030. And there are really a lot of challenges, even in that value chain, right, around are there really the right commercial frameworks for non-associated gas to work? Is there cost-reflective tariffs, not just on production, but also on the evacuation infrastructure for gas, the security issues, the continued non-payment for gas by electricity value chain players. So there are lots of issues, I think, even on the natural gas side, that need to be resolved for us to really make progress, towards achieving the goals set out in the energy transition plan.
Yes, and for me, the interesting part about the transition plan is renewables are actually the quickest way to get generation on grid. A solar plant, soups to nuts, 2 years, and you should be pretty good to go. While if you're trying to do a hydro or do a thermal generation plant, you've got a couple more years to add to that number. So it would behoove government and it would behoove Nigeria in general to focus on getting more renewables on grid. I know the 14 solar projects that were signed up in 2016, the tariffs have since come down to something a bit more reasonable. But I know that the injection points are not able to take the power once it comes on, given the intermittent nature of solar. So are there really strong pushes to get the transmission side to be able to accept this power when it comes on grid?
Yes, and I think this is the area where there needs to be, a lot of focus. And hopefully, once you also delineate the TSP, ISO, you're then able to understand who is responsible for what, especially on the integration of renewables into the sector. And then you can more aggressively try and attract investments into that space. And again, you also need to then find commercial frameworks that work for that investment, right? So if you have peaker gas units that aren't always on, but then someone has to pay for the electricity even when they are not on, right? So you need those commercial frameworks that would work. And I think an effort really to crowd in private sector investments in transmission is something that I think stakeholders in government realize. And so we just need to really find models that work and, present, very specific business cases to investors. There's currently now a lot more visibility regarding what the transmission company is doing. There's a lot more coordination happening between the transmission company and FGN Power that is to implement the presidential power initiative. Because you want a situation where, we're optimizing, right? Trying to make sure that, both parties have full visibility into what each other are doing, and it's aligned to a performance improvement plan that the sector has agreed on. Again, in that light, I think there was the NERC order that now requires TCN to get feedback from distribution companies regarding their performance improvement plans, because you previously had a situation where TCN was building out infrastructure that wasn't necessarily translating to power getting to discos. But if discos are saying, these are the areas where we need infrastructure and there's alignment and then coordination between all the parties that are investing in transmission, then hopefully, we'll begin to prioritize a set of projects that we would be pushing through government procurement. And then we crowd in, private investments also to come and fund specific parts of that performance improvement plan. So I think the pieces are coming together and hopefully would see much progress in the coming months.
Excellent. This could go on forever, given how interesting the sector is. But back in the day, there was a bit of data that the OVP's office used to share. I'm sure you're aware of it. And that gave people insight to see how the sector was performing and understanding all the different parts of the sector, the different metrics. Is that something that your team would begin to share more publicly? Because I feel like a number of sector operatives don't have an idea on what's really happening behind the scenes. It seems that the sector is back to being very segmented.
Yes, so I think maybe there are two parts to that question. I think in terms of the best kind of available operational data and sector-wide performance, obviously the reports that NERC has now been, I think, in a more timely fashion publishing is probably like the best, set of insights that are currently out there. But you hit, I think, the nail on a core question that is on many stakeholders' minds around how is this sector being coordinated. Obviously, you have a very complex stakeholder map in the sector. 80% of generation is from gas. Gas sits under a different ministry. You have the Ministry of Finance having under its purview MBET, and now MOFI increasingly playing a part. So there are many moving pieces, and everyone is now wondering, where is that central coordination? And I think one of the things that have happened in the last 3 to 4 weeks is that the ministers of power, finance, budget, and economic planning have come together really to start regularly meeting, convened by the coordinating minister of the economy, to talk on issues that are cross-cutting in nature. And I'm sure that that current group of ministers would hopefully also then expand to include, other relevant stakeholders, especially in gas, right? So this is kind of like the format that is currently in place of the power sector working group that existed during the last administration. So there is some form of coordination happening, but I think we should try, to your point, to make sure that there's also visibility from some of the work that that group is doing.
Excellent. So I know there was a conversation we just had around solar and around renewables on grid. Over the last 2 years, there's been a bit of research around wind generation in country as a generation source. The Ministry of Power gave some reports that an actual holistic research or study hasn't been done since 2004. Technology has drastically changed in the last 20 years. So back then, you had turbines that needed 6 or 7 meters per second as far as the wind speed to actually turn the turbines. But that has changed now. Now you're down to 3 to 4 meters per second. And further research has now shown that in Nigeria, there's at least 20 different states that have that much capacity for wind to actually use as a generation source. So the Global Wind Energy Council worked with a few of us, and we've established the Nigeria Wind Energy Council to really look at wind generation. Is that something that would be interesting to the Office of the Vice President as far as exploring to see how we could get some support to move this conversation from desktop to actually implementing a wind project? Because for us, studies are good, but we have 18 million people, 19 million people who don't have access. So we're looking at what are the other angles we could look at to see how we could quickly increase access, and wind is one of the ones we've arrived at. So would that be something the Office of the Vice President would support?
Absolutely. I think there's great appetite to support these initiatives. As you're aware, also there's I think more broadly in the sector work that is being done around the integrated resource plan for the sector, really looking at what sources of power make sense across the country. And then also I'm aware that the Rural Electrification Agency is currently working on an electrification plan, really to identify what are the electrification rates in different parts of the country, what parts does grid extension make sense for, what parts do mini grids make sense for, but then ultimately how do we then incorporate some of these new technologies as we think of our broader electrification plan. So definitely there's a lot of appetite, I think, there. And I think the good thing is that right now the thinking in the sector has moved towards having updated plans that stakeholders are aligned behind. So definitely, if we make sure that we're including all the available sources into a plan that everybody is aligned with, that creates visibility for the sector, it creates visibility for investors. Hopefully that's how we move those projects. But I think on the specific things that you're working on is certainly something that we would love to support.
So looking at 2024, we're 20-something days old into the new year. What are some of the big wins that government wants to see to get out of this year? Or things, if on the 31st of this year you could reflect and say, yes, all the things we wanted to do in the sector were actually achievable?
Yeah, I think at a high level for us, we should see this year as, the year of realignment and clarity for the sector. And I think that's on many fronts, right? From a governance policy perspective, we need sort of clarity regarding, what is the role that states are going to play in this sector, plan that is stakeholder aligned. Again, from a governance perspective, the hope is that we're going to continue seeing stronger regulatory action on licensees, to ensure that the worst performers really do not have a place in the market. And obviously there are issues around the unbundling of TCN that again is built for this year. So these are areas that I think we're definitely going to see just from a governance perspective. Operationally, I think there are a few priorities that we need to iron out. I think one, certainly on gas to power. How do we really move to actual enforceable contracts on gas versus best endeavor that has really not brought much to the table, for the producers of the gas or for the power sector, right? I think we definitely are going to see a lot more happening, to close the metering gap. Currently, a 7 million, metering gap, which sounds like a lot, but the cost of closing that gap is probably 50% of what we're going to spend on subsidies this year, right? So hopefully that's an area where there's going to be a realization. And I think, through the presidential metering initiative that has been announced, there's already a lot of momentum there. There's already 1.5 million meters that have been procured through the DISREP program. So there's some movement there, and hopefully by the end of the year, we'll get to a point where we have line of sight into closing the gap on the metering side. On sector financing, obviously we're in a place where sector liquidity is currently extremely challenged. Deals, especially to GenCos and gas companies, are not being paid. So we want to definitely see increased clarity, one, towards a plan towards moving towards cost reflectiveness, but also in the short term, ensuring that all of the subsidy burden that the federal government is assuming is well funded, well financed, and well communicated, so that there isn't any nervousness from any of the value chain players regarding whether they're going to get paid on time or not. And then on electrification, I think we're going to definitely see the development of an electrification plan, like I mentioned earlier, that should really be a very clear roadmap regarding the pathway to closing the electrification gap, 90 million Nigerians. And hopefully what we're going to see is, a lot of work being done on having models, scalable models, whether it's on-grid or off-grid for renewables. So that's really the focus. I do think we're kind of in a strange place where many stakeholders would say, we're never going to see an Azura type project, happening in Nigeria because of the lack of appetite for government to give guarantees and whatnot. But if we're not going to have Azura type projects, we need to have alternatives. Either the private sector would step in to provide those guarantees, or we look for ring-fenced opportunities where we find, viable, commercially viable projects to execute, so that at least we're moving forward in terms of both the power that we're wheeling into the grid, but also closing the electrification gap that we have.
Interesting, and I think this will then boil down to that coordination you mentioned with a few of the ministers and agreeing to make these numbers work. So thank you so much, Sadiq. Do you have any final words, any words you want to leave us with?
No, I think, thank you. It's been a great conversation. For me, my mantra this year is really to find pockets of commercially viable project opportunities that we can help drive, whilst also really thinking about the broader sector reforms that need to happen to ensure that the sector, we have a functioning market, long term. But thank you so much for the invitation and for the conversation.
Thank you, Sadiq, and we will look forward to having you at the end of the year when all these things you said would come true.
I'll blame others if they don't.
Thank you.